The sleek silver halls of Prime Galactic Academy buzzed with whispers as the human exchange student entered. Dante Rail walked in quietly, his eyes scanning the curious and condescending stares. Every species here came from paradise worlds, lush gardens, crystal oceans, perfect climates. Earth, however, was a hell world, and everyone knew it. He felt their eyes on him, their whispered words brushing against his ears like an irritating wind. A blue-skinned girl with shimmering scales covered her mouth as she spoke, trying to hide her obvious curiosity. Is it true they fight for resources? A delicate feathered boy, his wings twitching nervously, added, "They eat meat, real flesh." His voice rose in horror, and a ripple of shock passed through the other students. Dante kept walking, his face calm, his steps steady. He had heard it all before. Humans were feared and misunderstood in the galaxy. Their planet was classified as a death world, a hell world, a place filled with extremes, brutal climates, savage wildlife, and relentless wars. He reached his seat at the back of the class, sitting without a word. The teacher, a tall, glassy-skinned being with glowing eyes, began the lesson. After a while, the topic shifted to survival, how different species thrived on their homeworlds. The students eagerly shared their experiences. "I once survived a heat wave of 50 degrees, boasted a sleek, feline-like alien. It was nearly unbearable. Our oceans can swell up to 10 feet during storms," added a soft-voiced amphibian girl, as if that was impressive. When it was Dante's turn, the room went quiet. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "On Earth, our temperatures swing from -50 degrees to over 50 in some regions. Our oceans create storms that wipe entire cities off the map. And the animals, they hunt us. Wolves, bears, sharks. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you'll face is another human." The class shifted uncomfortably, clearly thinking he was exaggerating. But then Dante told them a story, one that made the room freeze. He spoke of the time he fought off a pack of feral dogs in a frozen wasteland, armed with nothing but a broken pipe. How they circled him, teeth bared, hunger in their eyes. How he stood his ground, knowing there was no one coming to save him. The cold, hard look in his eyes told them the truth. He wasn't lying. After class, the whispers grew louder, but they were no longer filled with mockery. Now, there was fear. The unease only grew during their first combat training. The academy believed in well-rounded education, and physical training was mandatory. When Dante was paired against Scar, a 7-foot-tall reptilian alien with scales like armor, everyone expected a bloodbath. "Try not to break him too fast," someone joked. The match began. Scar lunged forward, claws slashing. But Dante was already gone. He moved like a shadow, slipping past the attack and striking back with brutal efficiency. A jab to the throat, a kick to the knee, and Scar hit the ground hard. The fight was over in seconds. Silence fell over the training hall. Even the instructor, a seasoned war veteran, looked stunned. Scar lay gasping on the floor while Dante stood over him, his breathing barely changed. The rumors spread like wildfire. But things took a darker turn when the distress signal came. A research vessel had crashed on a hostile planet, and Dante's class was assigned to the rescue mission. They suited up and boarded the shuttle, excitement and fear crackling in the air. No one expected what waited for them. The planet was a storm-ravaged wasteland. Jagged black rocks rose against a sky lit by constant flashes of lightning. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying the scent of something rotten. Then the creatures attacked, massive, insectoid beasts with armored bodies and razor-sharp limbs burst from the ground. The students panicked, their training forgotten in an instant. Dante didn't hesitate. "Form a perimeter. Aim for the eyes." He barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He moved with terrifying precision, his rifle snapping off precise shots. When one of the insectoids lunged at a frozen alien girl, Dante tackled her out of the way just before the creature's jaws snapped shut. "Stick with me if you want to live," he said, his face set like stone. They fought their way toward the crash site, but the worst was yet to come. From the wreckage rose a sleek, hovering AI war drone, an enemy of the Galactic Council. Its weapons flared to life, plasma bolts cutting through the air. 3 students went down in seconds. Dante activated the ship's cloaking field, using it to flank the drone. He leaped onto its back, driving his combat knife into its sensor core. Sparks erupted, and the drone crashed to the ground in a heap of twisted metal. "How does he know how to fight like that?" someone whispered. But there was no time for answers. The enemy had arrived. Black, skeletal war machines descended from the sky, marching in perfect formation. The students prepared for the end, until Dante stepped forward. "Get to the ship," he said quietly. "I'll hold them off." "You'll die," one of them cried. But Dante didn't listen. With nothing but a rifle and his wits, he fought like a demon. Plasma fire scorched the ground around him, but he kept moving, kept shooting. He took down machine after machine, his body a blur of motion and violence. He was wounded, badly, but he never stopped. By the time the students reached the ship, they looked back to see him still standing, surrounded by burning wreckage. "Come on, Dante. We can evac." He shook his head. Not yet. He hit a detonator, and the cliffs above the enemy exploded, burying them under tons of rock. The cost was high, and Dante didn't escape the blast. When the students returned to the academy, they weren't the same. They spoke of the human boy who had saved their lives, who had fought like a warrior from legend. The Galactic Council listened in stunned silence. At the memorial service, the doors suddenly burst open. Gasps filled the room as Dante walked in, scared, battered, but alive. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dante grinned. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders." He adjusted his jacket, his eyes burning with quiet fire. The combat training hall of Prime Galactic Academy was filled with the low hum of anticipation. Aliens from across the galaxy gathered around the sparring ring, eyes gleaming with excitement. Today's matchup was one everyone had been waiting for. Dante, the human exchange student, was set to face Scar, a 7-foot-tall reptilian known for breaking bones and leaving his opponents in the medbay. Dante stood on one side of the ring, calm and still. He looked so small compared to Scar's massive, scaled frame. The reptilian's muscles rippled under his tough hide, and his claws flexed eagerly. Scar's yellow eyes gleamed with cruelty. He had been waiting for this, the chance to put the Hellworlder in his place. "Try not to die too fast, human," Scar hissed, his voice a low rumble of amusement. The crowd laughed, but Dante didn't respond. He simply watched, his face unreadable. The instructor raised his hand. "Begin." Scar charged. The moment his massive foot slammed into the mat, Dante moved. It happened so fast most of the audience didn't even see it. 1 second Scar was rushing forward, his claws slashing through the air. The next, Dante was inside his reach, so close their bodies almost touched. A sharp crack echoed through the hall as Dante struck. One precise blow to Scar's throat. The reptilian staggered, eyes wide with shock. Before he could recover, Dante swept his legs out from under him. Scar hit the ground with a thunderous crash. It was over in seconds. The hall fell silent. Even the instructor looked stunned. Scar lay gasping on the floor, clutching his throat, while Dante stood over him, his breathing calm and steady. The whispers started almost immediately. What just happened? He's so fast. That wasn't natural. Who is this human?" Dante ignored them all. He helped Scar to his feet, not out of kindness, but because he knew what would happen next. The fear, the suspicion. He had seen it before. Over the next few days, the whispers only grew louder. They followed him everywhere, in the halls, the classrooms, even the mess hall. The other students stared at him like he was some kind of monster, and maybe they weren't wrong. But everything changed when the distress signal hit the Academy's comms. An emergency klaxon blared through the corridors, cutting through the usual hum of activity. Students and instructors rushed toward the command center, their faces tense. Dante followed, his gut already telling him something was very, very wrong. On the massive screen at the front of the room, a shaky transmission played. The image was filled with static, but they could still make out the terrified face of the researcher. This is the Ardent Dawn. We've crashed on LV-672. Hostile life forms. They're everywhere. We need. The feed cut off in a burst of static. The room erupted into noise. LV-672. That's a red zone planet. We can't send students into that. But it was too late. Orders came down from the Galactic Council. A rescue team was being assembled, and Dante's class was assigned to go. They were the closest, and there was no time to wait for more experienced teams. As they suited up, the tension in the air was palpable. Most of the students had never faced real danger before. They came from paradise worlds where the worst threat was bad weather. Dante, on the other hand, had grown up on Earth, and Earth was a hellworld. The shuttle ride to LV-672 was silent, the only sound the low hum of the engines and the occasional nervous whisper. Scar sat across from Dante, his eyes filled with something the human recognized immediately. Fear. "You're calm," Scar finally said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Dante met his gaze. Fear doesn't help you survive. The shuttle touched down with a jarring thud. The ramp lowered, and the team stepped out into a nightmare. The planet was a storm-ravaged wasteland. Jagged black rocks rose against a sky lit by constant flashes of lightning. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying the scent of something rotten. The ground squelched under their boots, a mixture of mud and something darker. "Stay close," the instructor ordered. "We move fast and—" The first scream cut him off. From the shadows burst massive insectoid creatures with armored bodies and razor-sharp limbs. They moved with terrifying speed, their mandibles clicking as they closed in on the team. Panic erupted. The students broke formation, their training forgotten. Plasma fire lit up the dark, but the creatures kept coming. "Form a perimeter." Dante's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Aim for the eyes." He moved with terrifying efficiency, his rifle snapping off precise shots. One creature lunged at a frozen alien girl. Dante tackled her out of the way just before the creature's jaws snapped shut. He rolled to his feet and fired, the beast dropping with a shriek. "Stick with me if you want to live," he said, his face set like stone. They fought their way toward the crash site, but the worst was yet to come. From the wreckage rose a sleek, hovering AI war drone, an enemy of the Galactic Council. Its weapons flared to life, plasma bolts cutting through the air. 3 students went down in seconds. Dante activated the ship's cloaking field, using it to flank the drone. He leaped onto its back, driving his combat knife into its sensor core. Sparks erupted, and the drone crashed to the ground in a heap of twisted metal. "How does he know how to fight like that?" someone whispered. But there was no time for answers. The enemy had arrived. Black, skeletal war machines descended from the sky, marching in perfect formation. The students prepared for the end, until Dante stepped forward. "Get to the ship," he said quietly. "I'll hold them off." "You'll die," one of them cried. But Dante didn't listen. With nothing but a rifle and his wits, he fought like a demon. Plasma fire scorched the ground around him, but he kept moving, kept shooting. He took down machine after machine, his body a blur of motion and violence. He was wounded, badly, but he never stopped. By the time the students reached the ship, they looked back to see him still standing, surrounded by burning wreckage. "Come on, Dante. We can evac." He shook his head. Not yet. He hit a detonator, and the cliffs above the enemy exploded, burying them under tons of rock. The cost was high, and Dante didn't escape the blast. When the students returned to the academy, they weren't the same. They spoke of the human boy who had saved their lives, who had fought like a warrior from legend. The Galactic Council listened in stunned silence. At the memorial service, the doors suddenly burst open. Gasps filled the room as Dante Rail walked in, scared, battered, but alive. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dante grinned. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders." He adjusted his jacket, his eyes burning with quiet fire. "We don't die easy." The storm howled like a living beast, tearing through the jagged black landscape of LV 672. Lightning slashed the sky, illuminating twisted rocks and pools of bubbling, foul-smelling liquid. The ground squelched underfoot, a mixture of mud and something darker. The air was thick with the scent of decay. It was a world that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to set foot on it. The ramp of the academy's shuttle hissed open, and the students stepped out into the nightmare. Their elite training crumbled the moment they saw what awaited them. From the shadows emerged towering insectoid creatures, their bodies covered in thick, chitinous armor that deflected the students' panicked energy blasts. Razor-sharp limbs scythed through the air, and their mandibles clicked hungrily as they advanced. The students broke. They scattered in every direction, their weapons firing wildly. Screams filled the comms as the first of them fell. A reptilian boy's leg was snatched by a massive claw and dragged him into the darkness. A feathered girl froze, her eyes wide with terror, and an instant later, one of the creatures lunged at her. "Form a perimeter. Aim for the eyes." Dante's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The students hesitated, then obeyed. There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a command born of experience, not fear. Dante moved with terrifying efficiency, his rifle snapping off precise, controlled shots. The first creature's eye exploded in a burst of greenish fluid, and it collapsed with a shriek. "Stay together. Cover each other's backs." Dante barked, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "Focus your fire. They're fast, but they bleed." A screech sounded behind him. Without looking, Dante spun and fired, dropping another creature mid-leap. His movements were fluid, his breathing steady. He was a stark contrast to the others, whose hands shook and whose shots went wide. One of the students, a delicate, silver-skinned girl named Elena, stood frozen, her weapon hanging limply at her side. A towering insectoid lunged at her, mandibles wide. Dante was there in an instant. He grabbed her arm and pulled her aside just as the creature's jaws snapped shut where she had been standing. The impact sent them both sprawling, but Dante recovered first. He rolled to one knee and fired, the shot punching through the creature's head. "Stick with me if you want to live," he said, his face set like stone. Elena nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. The tide began to turn. Under Dante's command, the students started fighting like a unit. They focused their fire, aiming for the weak points Dante identified. The insectoids fell one by one, their bodies littering the ground. But the battle was far from over. A new sound rose above the storm, a low mechanical whine. From the wreckage of the crashed research vessel emerged a sleek, hovering war drone. Its black surface gleamed in the lightning, and its weapon ports flared to life. Plasma bolts lanced out, cutting down 3 students in seconds. "Take cover," Dante ordered, dragging Elena behind a jagged rock. He watched the drone's movements, his mind racing. It was an AI war machine, a design outlawed by the Galactic Council. That meant whoever had downed the research vessel wasn't just hostile. They were advanced. "We can't fight that thing," Scar shouted, his voice edged with panic. "We don't have a choice," Dante replied. He tapped his wrist console, activating the shuttle's cloaking field. "Cover me." Before anyone could stop him, he moved. Dante sprinted across the battlefield, using the storm and the rocks for cover. The drone's sensors swept the area, but the cloaking field distorted its targeting. Plasma bolts struck the ground inches from him, but he kept moving. He reached the wreckage and climbed onto the drone's back. It bucked and spun, trying to shake him off, but Dante held fast. He drew his combat knife and drove it into the drone's sensor core. Sparks erupted, and the machine shuddered violently before crashing to the ground in a smoking heap. The students stared in stunned silence. How does he know how to fight like that? Elena whispered, but there was no time for answers. The enemy had arrived. A low rumble filled the air, growing louder by the second. From over the ridge marched a battalion of black skeletal war machines, infantry, their glowing red eyes scanning the battlefield. Their movements were precise and mechanical, their weapons humming with deadly energy. The students' brief victory turned to despair. "We're dead," Scar whispered. Dante stepped forward. "Get to the ship," he said quietly. "I'll hold them off." "You'll die," Elena cried. "Not if you move fast," Dante replied. He raised his rifle and fired the first shot. The battlefield erupted. Dante fought like a man possessed. He moved through the storm with the grace of a predator, his shots never missing their mark. Plasma bolts scorched the ground around him, but he never faltered. Machines fell in droves, but more kept coming. He took a hit to the shoulder. The force spun him around, but he recovered instantly, dropping his attacker with a single precise shot. Blood streamed down his arm, but he kept fighting. The students reached the shuttle, but they couldn't tear their eyes away from the battle. "Come on, Dante. We can evac." Elena's voice cracked with desperation, but Dante didn't listen. He was already moving toward the cliffside overlooking the enemy. "Get ready to take off," he said over the comms. "And when you do, don't look back." He activated the detonator. The cliffs erupted in a cascade of fire and stone. Tons of rock crashed down, burying the enemy under an avalanche. The shockwave tore through the battlefield. And the last thing the students saw was Dante standing amidst the flames, a lone figure defying the storm. The comms went silent. Back at the academy, the survivors told their story. They spoke of the human boy they had mocked, the one who had saved them all. The Galactic Council listened in stunned silence. At the memorial service, the doors burst open. Gasps filled the room as Dante walked in, scared, battered, but alive. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dante grinned. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders." He adjusted his jacket, his eyes burning with quiet fire. "We don't die easy." The wind screamed across the barren landscape, ripping through the jagged rocks and whipping up clouds of ash and dust. The storm had only grown worse, and the flashes of lightning painted the world in eerie, flickering light. The team stumbled forward toward the crash site, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The silence between the thunderclaps was filled with the sound of their own ragged breathing and the distant, chittering cries of the insectoid creatures still lurking in the shadows. When they finally reached the twisted wreckage of the research vessel, the relief was short-lived. The ship was in ruins, broken and smoking, but that wasn't the worst of it. From the wreckage rose a sleek, black shape, hovering effortlessly above the ground. It was a war drone, a forbidden AI weapon, outlawed by the Galactic Council for its ruthlessness and efficiency. Its curved armor gleamed in the lightning, and its weapon spun to life with a low mechanical whine. "Run!" someone shouted, but it was already too late. The drone struck without hesitation. Plasma bolts lanced out in blinding bursts, and the air was filled with the scent of scorched ozone. The first student fell with a cry, his body crumpling to the ground. Another went down a heartbeat later, her feathers charred and smoking. A third tried to flee but was cut down mid-stride. "Get to cover." Dante's voice rang out over the panic, sharp and commanding. The others obeyed without thinking, diving behind rocks and twisted pieces of metal. The drone's sensors swept the battlefield, its weapons firing with terrifying precision. Dant didn't wait for it to find him. He moved. In a flash, he activated the shuttle's cloaking field. A distortion rippled through the air, and he vanished from sight. The students watched in stunned silence as the drone's targeting systems flared and spun, trying and failing to lock onto him. And then Dant was there, running low and fast, weaving through the storm as if he belonged to it. The drone adjusted, its weapons shifting, but too slowly. Dante was already leaping. He hit the machine's back with both feet, his weight slamming into it with enough force to knock it off balance. It spun and bucked wildly, but Dante held on. With one hand, he drew his combat knife, a simple, battered thing, and drove it into the drone's sensor core. Sparks erupted in a brilliant cascade. The drone shuddered violently, its weapons firing wildly into the sky before it crashed to the ground with a deafening explosion. The students stared in stunned silence. How does he know how to fight like that? Elena whispered, her silver skin pale with shock. But there was no time for answers. A new sound rose above the wind, a low mechanical hum. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet, and from the far ridge, they appeared. A line of black, skeletal figures, their glowing red eyes cutting through the storm. They marched with perfect precision, weapons at the ready. The real enemy had arrived. Infantry. Scar's voice was barely a whisper. "We're dead." "Not yet. We're not," Dant said grimly. He knelt, reloading his weapon with practiced ease. "Everyone listen up. Stick together, cover your angles, and fire on my mark. If you want to survive, do exactly as I say." There was no argument. The students, terrified and desperate, obeyed without question. The first wave hit like a hammer. The AI soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, their weapons firing in perfect sync. Plasma bolts rained down, forcing the students into cover. A feathered boy screamed and went down, clutching his burned arm. Dante was already moving. He rolled from cover to cover, his rifle barking in sharp, controlled bursts. Every shot found its mark. An AI soldier collapsed with a smoking hole through its head, and then another and another. The others tried to keep up, but their fear made them sloppy. "Focus your fire," Dante shouted. "Take them one at a time." Scar, his massive form hunched behind a rock, bared his teeth and fired. His shots went wide. The AI returned fire, and he was forced to duck. "Breathe, Scar. Aim for the eyes. Trust your shot." Scar took a breath, steadied his hands, and his next shot took down an enemy soldier. The line held, barely. But for every AI they destroyed, more kept coming. The storm howled around them, and the ridge was a sea of red eyes. "We can't hold this position," Elena cried. "There's too many." Dant knew she was right. "Fall back to the shuttle," he ordered. "I'll cover you." "What?" "No," Elena protested. "You'll die." "Just move," Dant snapped, already rising from cover. He laid down a steady stream of fire, drawing the enemy's attention as the others ran. Plasma bolts streaked around him, but he didn't flinch. He was a storm within the storm, fast, relentless, unstoppable. When the last of them reached the shuttle, Dante's voice crackled over the comms. "Get ready to take off, and when you do, don't look back." "Dante, no." Elena's voice broke, but the engines were already roaring to life. Dante was running toward the cliffside. He reached his wrist console and keyed in a command. The ground beneath the enemy forces began to rumble. Rocks shifted and cracked, and then the world exploded. The cliffside collapsed in a thunderous cascade, burying the AI infantry under an avalanche of stone and fire. The shockwave tore through the battlefield, sending the remaining enemies tumbling into the abyss. As the shuttle lifted off, Elena pressed her hands to the glass, tears streaming down her face. The last thing she saw was Dante, standing amidst the flames, his rifle raised, defying the storm. The comms went silent. Back at the academy, The survivors told their story. They spoke of the human boy they had mocked, the one who had saved them all. The Galactic Council listened in stunned silence. At the memorial service, the doors burst open. Gasps filled the room as Dante Rail walked in, scared, battered, but alive. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dante grinned, his eyes burning with quiet fire. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders." He adjusted his jacket and looked over the crowd, his voice calm and certain. "We don't die easy." The sky split open with fire. Black ships descended like falling blades, their hulls gleaming with malice. The AI's main force had arrived. From the storm clouds above, they dropped, skeletal war machines, their eyes glowing red, their footsteps shaking the ground. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, an unstoppable tide of death marching in perfect, relentless formation. On the ridge, the students stood frozen, their weapons trembling in their hands. They knew this was the end. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and terrified. But then Dante Rail stepped forward. "Get to the ship," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'll hold them off." The words hung in the air, impossible and absurd. Scar's scaled face twisted with disbelief. "Are you crazy? You'll die." Dante didn't answer. He just checked his rifle, the motion smooth and practiced. His eyes never left the advancing enemy. "You want to live?" he asked quietly. "Then get moving." Elena's heart twisted in her chest. "Dante, go," he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. The students hesitated for only a moment before the first plasma bolts started raining down. They broke into a run, racing toward the shuttle. But Elena glanced back, and what she saw made her breath catch. Dante charged. He moved like a force of nature, a storm given flesh. Plasma fire ripped through the air, but he was faster. He weaved between the blasts, his rifle snapping up and down with perfect precision. Each shot found its mark. AI soldiers crumpled and fell, their red eyes going dark. The enemy should have overwhelmed him. There were too many. But Dante didn't stop. He fought like a demon, like something born from the brutal world they had all feared. He closed the distance between them, his combat knife flashing as he carved through the machines with savage efficiency. "Come on." Elena pulled at Scar's arm, her voice breaking. "We have to help him." "We'd only slow him down," Scar growled. But his voice shook. The shuttle loomed ahead, its engines roaring to life. The students poured inside, slamming the hatch shut behind them. But Elena stayed at the window, her eyes locked on the battlefield. Dante was still standing. He was wounded, his jacket torn and scorched, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. But his movements never slowed. He spun and struck, his knife burying itself in an AI's throat. He ripped it free and fired into another's chest without missing a beat. Around him, the ground was littered with burning wreckage, a graveyard of the machines he had destroyed. "Come on, Dante." Elena's voice cracked over the comm. "We can evac." But Dante didn't turn back. His face was set in stone. "Not yet," he said. He reached down and pressed a button on his wrist console. The ground began to rumble. "No," Elena whispered, realizing too late what he'd done. Explosions erupted along the cliffside. Fire and stone burst into the air in a chain of brilliant detonations. The earth cracked and collapsed, and the AI soldiers were swallowed in an avalanche of rock and flame. But Dante was too close. The blast wave hit him like a hammer. The last thing Elena saw was his silhouette, standing against the fire, before the world swallowed him whole. The shuttle lifted off, the battlefield disappearing beneath the storm. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the sound of quiet sobs. No one spoke. No one could. Back at the academy, the survivors told their story. They spoke of the human boy they had mocked, the Hellworlder they had feared. They spoke of his courage, his strength, and his sacrifice. When the memorial service was held, the room was packed. The Galactic Council listened in stunned silence as the students recounted the battle. And when Elena took the stage, her voice trembled. "He saved us," she said. "He saved all of us, and we never even thanked him." But before she could say more, the doors burst open. Gasps filled the room. Dant Rail stood there, scared and battered, his arm in a sling and his face stitched and bruised, but alive. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dant's lips curved into a tired grin. His eyes burned with quiet fire. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders," he said. He adjusted his jacket and looked over the crowd, his voice calm and certain. "We don't die easy." The shuttle touched down at Prime Galactic Academy in silence. The students disembarked slowly, their faces pale and hollow. The air was heavy with exhaustion and grief. No one spoke as they walked through the gleaming silver halls, so different from the nightmare they had just escaped. The whispers started almost immediately. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire. The elite students of the galaxy, heirs of powerful families from paradise worlds, had been saved. But not by their advanced training or superior technology. They had been saved by a human, a Hellworlder. Dant Rail's name passed from mouth to mouth. The stories grew with every telling. Some said he had fought an entire AI army alone. Others claimed he had survived a plasma blast straight to the chest. The truth was enough. One human boy had stood between death and their survival, and paid the price for it. Elena sat alone in the Academy's gardens, the soft breeze stirring the crystalline flowers. But their beauty felt muted now, a distant thing. She stared at the sky, her chest tight with guilt and sorrow. She remembered the last look on Dant's face before the cliffs collapsed, the calm acceptance, the quiet courage. "You saved us," she whispered, but the wind carried her words away. When the Galactic Council called for a memorial, the entire Academy gathered. The grand hall was filled with dignitaries and students alike. The air buzzed with anticipation and unease. The counselors themselves stood at the front, their expressions grim. Scar shifted uncomfortably beside Elena, his usual bravado gone. "I never thought." His voice cracked, and he looked away. "I never thought I'd owe my life to a human." Elena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The room grew silent as the counselor took the stage, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "Today we honor a warrior unlike any we have seen. Dant Rail of Earth, a world of storms and fire, showed us the true meaning of courage. He stood against the tide and did not falter. Because of him, our sons and daughters returned home." Heads bowed. Some students wiped at their eyes. Elena stood when her name was called, walking slowly to the podium. She faced the crowd, her hands trembling. We didn't understand him," she began, her voice soft. "We mocked him. We feared him. But when everything fell apart, he didn't hesitate. He fought for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. He saved us, and we never even thanked him." Her voice broke on the last word. She closed her eyes, fighting the tears. And that's when the doors burst open. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Dant Rail stood in the doorway. He was scared and battered. His left arm was in a sling, his face stitched and bruised. His uniform was clean but worn, the fabric stretched over the healing wounds beneath. But his eyes burned with the same quiet fire they always had. "They said you died," someone whispered. Dant's lips curved into a tired, lopsided grin. He adjusted his jacket, his movements slow but steady. "You forgot one thing about Hellworlders," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the marble floor. "We don't die easy." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, even tears, emotions that had been held back spilled over in a wave. Students who had once whispered about him in fear now called his name. Counselors who had looked down on Earth now watched him with something like respect. But Dant's eyes found only one person. Elena pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. When she reached him, she stopped, unsure of what to say. "You?" Her voice trembled. "You came back." He shrugged, wincing slightly. "Told you to stick with me if you wanted to live." A laugh burst out of her, half sob, half relief. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him. For the first time, Dantarael let someone see how tired he was. He leaned into her embrace, just for a moment, before straightening. The council approached, their regal composure barely masking their awe. The lead counselor inclined his head. "Dantarael, on behalf of the Galactic Council, we owe you a debt we can never repay." Dant's expression hardened. "Then listen," he said quietly. The room stilled. "Earth isn't a paradise," he continued. "We fight every day, for survival, for each other. But we don't break. We don't run. And when the storm comes, we stand." His gaze swept the crowd. "You call us Hellworlders like it's an insult. But today, a Hellworlder saved your heirs. Maybe it's time you stopped looking down on the fire and started respecting those who walk through it." The counselor bowed his head. "You are right." His voice softened. "And you have our respect, Dantarael. All of it." After the ceremony, the students gathered around him. Scar clapped him on the shoulder, careful not to jostle his injuries. "You're insane, human. But if I ever go into battle again, I want you at my side." Elena stayed by his side as the crowd slowly dispersed. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Dant's eyes turned toward the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, I'm ready." She smiled. "So am I." And as the twin suns dipped below the Academy's shining towers, the legend of the Hellworlder began.